Hello, everyone. Very nice to see, hopefully, many of you here tonight. We are starting up our training course on peace and EU foreign policy. And I'm very happy to join here with some of my very experienced colleagues who have a lot of field experience as well on this topic and who I have worked with previously. So let's see what it's going to happen today. And this is hosted by Visio, and I will just be opening this event and then letting my colleagues speak later on. But first of all, I will share you a little bit of slides from here. And let's see, this is always exciting how it happens. Hmm. Yes, sorry for the delay. It's a bit slow, probably due to the internet. So now we are managing to. Perfect. Yes. So we talk a bit about EU and peace building. And our agenda is the introduction to this topic. Then we will have a speech by Hussein Al-Tae, who is a member of the Finnish parliament, and he will talk about the EU as a global peace actor and the future challenges of peace building. And we have a discussion there as well. Then we have Lorenzo Angelini from EPLO, and he will talk about climate change, peace, and conflict. And then we can discuss this topic as well. And then I will bring you some brief conclusions about this event. So yes, let's get started. What is peace? This is a discussion we are going to have today. And what is conflict and insecurity? Well, what we discuss often in the peace and conflict studies is that peace is not only absence of war or conflict, but it's also something positive. Galtung said this about positive peace, that we need to also have a society where people have the means to live a peaceful life and a good life as well. So meaning this, that peace is not only the absence of war, but it's also something more, especially for us who are in politics, and many of us are speaking here today. So I think that for us it's important to discuss also how we can build peace. Of course, we have to first and foremost secure that there is less conflict, and we have to build that kind of momentum. But then we also have to build the societies so that they are builded towards peace and not towards war and conflict. Conflict is rarely caused by one single factor, and of course this complicity in crisis is increasing, and Lorenzo will probably also give you a bit of words on this. But as you can see here in the slides, we have many ongoing conflicts. Of course, Ukraine is a lot of in discussion here in Finland, but also there are many other ones that we should discuss and that we should take even more action towards. Peace is a fundamental goal of the European Union. I think that many of you who are listening have also sometimes heard the quote about EU as a peace project. And this is something I, of course, agree with. I think that one of the reasons that I was inspired to run as a member of the European Parliament and now as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament is actually the fact that I want to bring more peace towards EU, but also globally. And I think it's very important that we see the history behind the European Union. We are not always happy and satisfied about what the EU does, but then again, EU has had a major role in stopping war and conflict in our region. But now all of this balance is, of course, very much shaken by the horrible attack of Russia against Ukraine. And this definitely does have an influence about how we see peace in this region and how EU acts for peace as well. For this commission of Ursula von der Leyen, there is a pillar of governance, peace and security, and they consider that a key pillar of the political vision of this Commission. And also the promotion of peace and security as a fundamental goal, which arises from the Treaty of the European Union. And also we have a Finnish commissioner, Jutta Urpilainen, who is working a lot with these topics. And this integration process of the EU as an inherently peace process has also driven the agenda of being a global peace actor. And here EU also has this global strategy on this topic. But there is a very complex institutional framework on peace that arises from many programs and documents. So the question is, does EU have a coherent policy on peace? I think that there are some measures that we find definitely important and some that EU is carrying out, which is very crucial. For example, some measures are preventive diplomacy and detecting early warning signs of conflict and creating early warning systems. Then also the EU does a lot of support to peace processes, from the negotiation part to the implementation of peace agreements, dialogue facilitation, confidence and trust building. Then, of course, there is the concept of EU peace mediation that has been used in various regions, and also support to civil society actors. And this is a bit related to what I mentioned about the positive peace, that to build this kind of positive peace and not only absence of conflict, we need to support these civil society actors that often are defending the human rights, democracy, rule of law, for example, in Russia or Ukraine, Poland, but also in other parts of the world. So this is something important that EU has to do, also support the civil society and those activists that work for peace in different ways. Then EU also does try to support democracy, and this is something that EU is also doing in many ways and with many projects. Then I think that it's important that we talk about the inclusiveness of these projects as well. Something that I have criticized the EU for is that there is a lot of programs, there is some funding, but this funding is often inaccessible to, for example, young people who have small organizations, who don't have big possibilities for fundraising and meeting the standards of certain applications. Then, of course, we also see that inside these projects, children, youth, women, minorities are often left sidelined. So I think it's important that we do try to build EU as a more inclusive peace actor as well. You know, when we look at those school books about EU and EU building peace in the history, we see a lot of older gentlemen shaking hands. And this is also a picture of the EU and EU politics that we still try to change to this day. And I think the same is very much true in many peace processes, that there is the difficulty of how do we actually give everybody the space to be involved. Because without that, it's very difficult to create any lasting peace processes and solutions, and in any way to build a good society without hearing everyone who is part of it. So this is why I find it important to promote women peace and security and youth peace and security agenda, for example, that arise from the UN actually. And here it's very important to have different kind of partnerships and appropriate measures so that we can meet this kind of goals. It needs a lot of funding, it needs to be streamlined in all of the EU documents, and we need to put all of this in practice as well. When we do discuss peace, we always must also discuss equality. Here is a map of these operations that EU has, which might be interesting. I won't go too in detail with this because I have also colleagues who we are interested to hear about, so we won't go through all of these EU operations. But as you can see, there are some key areas that have been selected. And also we can see with these processes, some are moving forward. There are some good goals that are met in peace building. But then, as you know, when you have followed peace building, it's a very slow processes and also a lot of setbacks. So this is something that is definitely true for these EU processes as well. This is actually the reason why peace processes are a bit difficult to sell to politicians. I must say that I find one of the biggest objectives that we should actually have more of these peace processes and have a bit more reactions with that. Of course, now, as we can see in the situation with Ukraine, for example, EU needs to use some force to also bring about peace. For example, we are aiding Ukraine with weapons, and we are aiding Ukraine by setting sanctions to Russia. And I think this is very much fair and right. But when we look at the bigger picture, in many areas, in many countries, what we need would actually be more preventive measures and peace building in different levels, different ways. And this is something that EU often fails to do. Actually, it's a bit easier for politicians as well to be sending boots on the ground, so to say, so to put about some military response and activities, because peace processes tend to last for a very long time. So this is why it might be difficult sometimes psychologically for politicians as well to put in that effort and put in that funding, because we are not so sure what the end result will be. But of course, if we go about any conflict with military means, we do not either know then that the ending result will be good. So this is why we must be critical about where the EU money is going into. And we definitely should see it for the first point that these peace building processes are the first means that we are trying. And this is something that we often fail in actually inside the EU. And the Greens have been quite vocal about that as well. These peace building processes are often not so successful, and then there might also be controversial points between EU's other policies and peace building activities. For example, there might be some concerns about human rights violations and conflict and aggressiveness of certain countries. But then the EU business negotiations and trade deals do not support this kind of concern. There is kind of going on with two paths, that at the same time EU is condemning something or trying to change something, but then we are doing business cooperation. I must mention China here, for example, and probably Russia also in the previous times. So this is difficult, and then there is always some other factors as well. For example, even more local trade agreements or questions that do not support the sustainable economy or the means that would be to build the positive peace. So this is the complex here. And then even though we have some early warning systems, then we have difficulties to react in time. So EU does not always manage to respond quickly enough. And this is definitely one issue. Also, the local ownership is part of many core issues that there are in the EU peace building and operations, because if there is no local ownership and hearing to the people who actually are involved and live in certain regions of conflict, there is no possibility for that kind of mission to do nothing but fail in this regard, basically. And I think that the EU is often failing in meeting these objectives that there are put. So this is something that we definitely want to work on, for example, from the Greens, and surely from my colleagues' side as well. I think now would be good time to open the Mentimeter. I probably think that Adele, you have the possibility to open that for me, so I can stop sharing briefly. Perfect. Yes, thank you. So I wanted to ask you before we go to the other great speakers that we have today to tell us a little bit about your expectations and thoughts about this point. And we would like to ask you what comes to your mind from the word peace. And what you can do is use this code that you can see on the screen. It's 54217401. And then you can put any kind of answer in there in this Mentimeter. So I will give us a few minutes, 2 minutes maybe, to write this. And you can be creative. There is no right or wrong answers here. So here, as you can see, for example, in my phone, you can go to this page and directly put your answers in. And there are 3 fields, 3 words that you can add for here. That's great. I can also already read some of these. There is safety of everyday life. Actually, safety in many ways is here. Also, freedom, one core thing, freedom of choice, stability, free trade, future, opportunity, home and family, prosperity, well being, love, basic human need. That's very much true. Pacifism, security. I think these very much reflect the thought of this positive peace that we have been talking about already. Yes, let's give still a few more seconds at least. Well, maybe 1 minute. Okay, I think we are about ready at this point. So basically, I would like to thank you for these answers. I think these really reflect what we have also in mind in my team, for example, in the EU, and I think that this also brings some food for thought for the other speakers. But and right now, I would also like to remind you that you can at any time partake this discussion also and write more of your thoughts in the comment section, and we can answer them also here. But now I would like to give the floor to Hussein Altae for about 20 minutes or so. And let's hear about Hussein, because I think Hussein has a very interesting experience with working, for example, for a crisis management initiative, and also working now as the member of the Finnish parliament. So bringing a bit about that positive peace also and building the Finnish society. So welcome, Hussein, and very great to have you here. And yes, please get started. We are excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Albina. And you might remember that we worked together at CMI. So it's great that we're working together again here. My name is Hussein Altae. I am a member of the Finnish Parliament at the moment since 2019. And before I became an MP, I was one of the people who worked for the peace mediator, President Martti Ahtisaari, and his team and his organization CMI, that worked in many continents on many different conflict resolution projects, and I was working, of course, on issues related to the Middle East, and I was heading the Iraq project for a while. And I still have some family members and friends who are still working with CMI, and I'm in close contact with them. I appreciate the work and try my best to support them also at the Finnish Parliament, and whatever I can be of help. Now, I came to Finland when I was 10 years old. Before that, I lived in a refugee camp in the middle of the desert in Saudi Arabia. We weren't allowed into the cities of Saudi Arabia. We were only allowed in the desert, in no man's land between Saddam Hussein's killing machine and the Saudi kingdom. And 3 years I spent in a tent with my family. Two of my siblings, my two sisters, were born in the tent. And when my mom was given labor in the early 1990s in that tent, she did not have anybody, so there was no nurse to actually deliver the baby, my sister. And she was in severe pain because of the delivery. So the lady who was helping her actually made the decision to burn her legs with the candle fire so that she would actually be burnt and feel more pain, and that she would push stronger to get rid of the pain that is coming also from the candle fire. Well, that worked, but I think it leave the trauma, because every time my mother mentions giving birth in the desert, she also mentions the trauma that she got from burning her feet. 3 years later, from a position of total desert, as a refugee, we were then transferred to Finland. Lakes, green trees, beauty. A lot of people who looked very different that from the people that I used to please see and are part of my family. But many years later, Finland became a home, and because of the Finnish education and the opportunities that we got, all of the 7 children that came from that refugee camp actually got an education, got employed, and one of them is a pilot, another one is a doctor, and I'm a member of parliament, and we have also people who are interested in arts and architecture and all that. So peace is definitely equality and opportunity. Peace is also, peace of mind that tomorrow might be better than today. And so having hope about tomorrow is very, very important. And I think this is the message that myself, Alvina, and I'm sure Lorenzo will be talking more about. Now, in regards to what I wanted to, speak about, I had a specific title to speak a little bit about the field experiences in regards to peace building to you, and also bring about some of the ideas that I have in regards to making sure that the peace table would actually house not only the men or the older men, but also youth and hopefully women. It is crazy, that absolutely lunatic, that 50% of the people who live in a certain region or spot, the women, 50%, aren't being given the 50% chance to be able to influence peace and influence what happens to their region and what happens to their children, what happens to their lives, and be able to bring about some of the ideas that they have. And so it is sad that only 8% of these negotiations house women in general, and women are being asked questions in regards to their futures in those regions. But in actual peace mediators and actual people who do this for a living, we have only 2% in the world. So 98% of everybody who's working on peace are men, and then 2% are women. And that's an absolutely sad story. Even the financial district in the UK, in London, has 90% men and 10% women working as top level jobs in the finance sector in London. So peace mediators, even less than that, and that's extremely sad. And that, I think, peace is not lasting, partly because there aren't women enough in bringing about some of these ideas. So I have 3 points that I want to talk about. The first one is what's going on globally and why we need peace, and what's the role of the EU. And the second point that I want to talk about is to what can we do to invest in peace, What should everybody do to make sure that the lasting change is possible? And then three, a little bit more about women. So as you well know, I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we're having today is that the world is being fractured and polarized, and there are these groups or groupings of countries that are working to strengthening their positions vis-a-vis the other groups. So we have China, and in many parts also Russia. One might say the BRICS countries in one way. So then you'd have a larger group of countries that are grouping in this polarized world, and then you have maybe the US and the EU, and then you might have some smaller fractures within African continent, for example, or you would have a smaller fractions even inside Europe. So when the UN was established, and yesterday was the International Peace Day, so happy Peace Day, everyone. When the UN was established, the idea of having a Security Council was to have a balance of actors. Today, the Security Council members are actually fracturing the world and making it less peaceful because of the national interest that these big players are having. And so the United Nations Security Council is not having enough room to be able to enact and work on peace processes the way that it should, and it is unable to prevent conflict. And because of the absence of the power that it should have in regards to building lasting peace, I think the EU has a potential and the power and the resources to actually become the body that would replace, in some cases, the lacking of the OSCE or the United Nations Security Council. But at the same time, one should not think that the EU would replace the UN in everything. One must remember that the UN was an extremely important organization when it came to trade, the movement of people, research, issues in regards to healthcare, and issues in regards to children's education, sanitary issues. So every other agency, UNHCR in terms of refugees, ILO in terms of labor rights, the World Food Program, there's extremely important agencies that together are definitely working towards a more peaceful world. And one should always appreciate that and never speak about the UN in a way that the UN completely failed the peace processes around the world. We are seeing a lot of prosperity, a lot of positive change because of the UN agencies. And one must be thankful for that and support those ideas and not cut funding like the US did when President Donald Trump was in the office. But when it comes to the United Nations Security Council, we're having definitely problems with that. And one might think that EU should be working a little bit more. And I think Albina, who's a member of the European Parliament, can also elaborate more on the issues the EU can be doing. But at least from my perspective, as an ex-peace mediator, as a member of Parliament, I want to say what EU should do. What EU should do is invest in local processes, long-lasting local processes. So rather than allow funding for CMI or another peace mediators, the funding should be 5 years to 10 years, because you need longer trust-building relationships to be able to enact a lasting peace. And when you secure the funding for a longer period, then you're able to have the freedom to include the people that were missing. You're able to search for the people who are missing from the table. So you look around the table, who should be here so that we'll have a lasting peace in, for example, Libya. And then you look around and say, okay, we don't have enough women. Definitely we should have more women. Well, we don't have enough youth. Then we'll have to bring more youth. but anybody who works in business, the entrepreneurs aren't here. So maybe we should bring people who have business interest in. And then you look around and you say, maybe there are those who are disenfranchised in different ways and are in minorities. Well, maybe they should be in this table also. And then you think, okay, well, there's the X regime. What can we do about that? And then you think that there are some people who are up and coming from the universities, the technocrats. Okay, what can we do about them? And when you have you want to have a possibility of a longer term funding, you're also able to look for a longer term solutions, and you're able to send that message as a peace mediator to the local communities that you're there to stay and that you want to be there and very, very much invested in their future for a long time. Not as somebody, and this never should be happening in peace mediation, not as somebody who says, I'll give you money, I'll give you resources, or I'll give you development aid if you do this. Peace mediation is about listening, and it's about allowing those, providing the table and allowing those who have a stake in the peace, who have a stake in the conflict, they always have a stake in the peace also, to sit around that table and provide the dialogue possibilities, and allow these people to come in and talk about the peace. And why the EU should be working sort of on longer lasting solutions through funding. The other reason is that there are many actors today. For example, in issues in regards to the Middle East, you'd have Iran, who might have a stake in some of these conflicts. You have Qatar, you have Saudi Arabia, you have the UAE nowadays more and more. You have Israel. So you have these countries who have a stake in maybe a stability in one place, and maybe in other places not so much stability for some national interest or other gains. So when the EU is there, which is a big player and a very strong market with a stable foreign policy, the idea is the EU is there to stay, so the room for these other actors will automatically step by step diminish. And this is something that we should also work on. And this is something that Alvina also mentioned in regards to China. For example, in Africa and other places, you can't do open trade with absolute possibilities, but at the same time, try to influence peace in the regions where China is doing a very negative job, and then you'll be sending very wrong signals. So long-lasting projects, long-lasting funding, where the EU stays there and fills the voids of the United Nations Security Council, of these other actors that might not have a stake in the stability, and also send the idea of trust to these peoples who are working to stabilize their own regions. And I think that should be the EU's role looking forward. But at the same time, when it comes to investment, that's my second point. It is very important for the EU to look at its budgetary means and see if we could derive at least 1% of the EU's budget towards a clear-cut peace projects, peace processes for a long time. So send that message that at least 1% of all of the money, the billions and billions and the trillions of euros that we're actually spending towards different kind of activities, 1% would actually go to peace projects. Or if the individual countries are spending a lot of money, as they are spending today, on getting weapons and supporting, for example, Ukraine in war, 10% out of the military spending, 10% would be then allocated clearly to peace processes. And why is that? Because peace actors today are working against the tide in many ways. I read yesterday from some of these experts that launched a campaign, Keys for Change, CMI's campaign, Keys for Change, which Alvina also took part in. The experts were saying that 1 minute of war costs 28 million euros. So 1 minute of warfare costs 28 million euros. With that 28 million euros, you can actually have 700 peace meetings around that table where you're asking people what's missing, what's wrong, and how can you develop the ideas towards peace. So 1 minute of war would equal 700 meetings where you're able to advance peace. So you're working against the tide because the money that is spent on warfare and on weapons is so much greater, millions of times greater than the money that is spent on peace. And so we have to be very sort of, note this. We have to note this, make a point out of it, and say the budgets are missing money on clear peace processes for a longer period. And that would be a clear investment for peace. And this is the time for it, as Europe has a raging war in Ukraine. So this is the exact time where you should be spending money on peace. And then my third issue, and I have only 3 minutes left, is in regards to women. And I started with that issue. My biggest point now, and I clearly feel that a lot of different organizations nowadays have goals towards having women in the peace tables. But my worry is that these women are included in the peace tables to discuss peace looking forward. They're more or less tokens. So EU should refrain from tokenism. They're there in terms of numbers. Much must be done in terms of capacity building to make sure that these women aren't numbers, but these women come in with an actual quality point of view. So you select, if you're able, women into these peace processes, but you actually spend more time in making sure that they'll have their say and they have all the capacities to be able to match whatever is needed in that table, and sort of not be there just in terms of numbers that'll show in some of the reports that the EU is circulating looking for the next funding. So longer term processes would also then allow women in terms of capacity building for being able to be included in peace processes, and hopefully the goal is 50%, as there are 50% of women, more or less. So the goal should be 50%. The last point that I have on the issue of women, I think there should be more dedicated schools around Europe, especially, but also elsewhere, where peace mediators are graduating from, and that we would make sure that people who actually come into those schools, at least 50% of those who attend these schools are women and men, 50 and 50, and make sure that the EU would also be part in funding these lines in these different universities, in these faculties, and that the peace mediation organizations, especially within the EU, would be able to recruit people from these universities and give them the opportunity and the responsibility to become future peace mediators looking forward. So I'll end with that. It's exactly 20 minutes, and we'll have maybe a little time for questions and discussions. I'm at your disposal.
Thank you so much, Hussein. I think that was very inspiring to hear your story and also your thoughts and analysis, and I couldn't agree with you more. And now I think there is some possibility for questions and comments and discussion. But Adele, how does this work? Should we be able to see some of questions here, or? I don't know if Adele can hear us, but first of all, I could actually answer one of the questions that was posted on the chat earlier, and it was about the concrete support that EU has for different civil society actors. And there is some thematic programs that are designed especially for civil society actors. for building capacities, for example, and democracy building, and activists basically, and their work and the community work. And this has been in the last 7 years 1.5 billion euros. So there is some concrete funding to that. But as Hussein said, we always wish that there would be more, because this is also about the EU priorities and what kind of activists and processes EU supports. So this is something that we find very important. Okay, maybe there are some questions to Hussein as well. Let me see. I will. Yes. Okay. So, first question: what do you think could be done in order to increase the amount of women being able to participate in peace building and negotiating? And this is something that was asked from Hussein. And also, I would like to add a question. How do you feel about, for example, when we have some criteria for funding for NGOs and peace processes? Should there be limits, for example, or regulations that how many women or young people had to be involved to get this kind of funding? Is there any benefit in such measures, for example, and what other measures you have? So go ahead.
Well, I'll talk about my own family. My wife is a peace mediator, who's very known actually. I'm not going to mention her name, but she's working on some of the very delicate files, also in terms of how important they are to the EU, and I'm also working a lot, sometimes 18 hours a day. One of the issues that we sometimes struggle with is when I'm flying from Finland to somewhere else, and when she's flying, and that work-life balance when it comes to women in peace mediation. I feel, even in my own family, where I'm very sort of, I note these issues. I think they're important. I know what the problem is. I know how important her job is. But in many ways, I feel that here and there, she's actually stealing some of the time that she should be spending on that peace process. And giving that time to me, giving that time to our family, giving that time to the kids. And I look at myself sometimes. I'm not stealing enough of that time to give her peace processes, to give it to our family. And I think one of the issues that one might think, and you might laugh or maybe smile listening to this, but I think if you're asking women, especially in the third world, on the developing world, to take part in the peace processes, you have to be able to answer the question, where are the kids going to be? Where are her children going to be while she's been asked to take part in the peace process and the dialogues, and maybe she would have to fly somewhere and do all of that. And one of the issues that one might ask these ladies and these women is what kind of a help you would need, what kind of facilities you would need for you to be able. Can we pay your nanny or your sister or somebody to make sure that you're able? Because a lot of women are saying, and I remember from the field, you know what, we can't come because on that day there's this, and on that day there's this, and I have to be with the children, I cannot travel. So sometimes maybe rather than saying, you should get, emancipate and get rid of the men and, be your, full 100% women with all of the rights that you have, maybe look at the local circumstances that they're having and try to facilitate some of these ideas, because you cannot demand from these people the exact same, demands that you have for people who live actually in Finland or live somewhere else where the work on equality is taken, further. So being able, and I know the EU budgets do not allow that. So you cannot actually spend money on somebody's nanny. It's impossible in the EU. You cannot justify that in any of the job budgets that you're having. And I made many budgets. So one of the things that I'm asking is, look at the circumstances of those women and what can you do as a peace mediator to make sure that they're able to actually come to your processes and come to that table and take the time out to be able to think. And I've also noticed that a lot of the women who are actually in the peace tables, they've actually selected a career and they're very career oriented. Most of the times they're single. Most of the times they don't have children. So clearly we're targeting women who don't have these other circumstances that some women might have. And we actually should look at those women also because they have a stake, especially if they have children in the peace processes. The very sort of maybe an easy example, not answering the entire problem, but at least part of the problem.
I think actually it was a great answer, and it reflected a bit about what are the concrete obstacles of women in participating. And same often goes, of course, for young people, that we assume that everybody has the means and money to travel or have such devices that you can use to connect with people, and secure internet connections, which are needed for some EU projects as well. And there is a lack of support for like these very concrete things that would enable people to partake more. So thank you so much, Hussein. I think that we have to soon move also to the other speakers, but we will continue with you later on. And I think this has been very fruitful and actually very concrete. And I hope also the participants have liked it. And if the participants have more questions for Hussein, please submit them as you have now through these comments in the chat. So we will then raise them also further. But thank you, Hussein.
You're welcome. If somebody has a questions later, of course, they can contact us, Alvina, yourself through Instagram, or myself through Instagram or Facebook. They'll find us using our names for sure. And if something comes up to your mind later, it's possible, of course, to ask that question then. And I, for myself at least, I'll be very happy to answer.
Excellent point. The same goes for me, of course. We try to be very much available for you in the social media. So thank you, Hussein. And next we will have a guest speaker, Lorenzo Angelini, who is from the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office. And he works as a policy officer. And since joining this organization, he has been also coordinating the EPLO's work on peace, development and security. So we are very excited to hear more what Lorenzo has to say. And also he will touch upon the topic of climate crisis and how this affects conflict and war and what we can do about it. So thank you so much, Lorenzo, and welcome. I will give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Elvina. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to join you today. So just a bit of context, my organization, the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, EPLO, is the independent civil society platform of European NGOs, networks of NGOs and think tanks, all committed to peace building and the prevention of violent conflicts. We have 48 member organizations currently. Some are multi-mandate organizations working also in development cooperation, humanitarian aid, and peace building, others working specifically on peace building. But many of those organizations are working on the interlinkages between climate change, peace and conflict that I'll be discussing today. So I'll immediately start my presentation. Let's see if it can load properly. It's very basic, so my apologies in advance. But I'll try to introduce and answer the question of why should the European Union and other international actors, obviously, ensure that their peace-building efforts are sensitive to climate change and that their climate actions are sensitive to peace and conflict. So what are those, Alvina and Hussein already discussed what peace and peace-building can mean and what it can involve. And I'll try to look at what is the relationship between peace and peace-building and the effects of climate change. So the first point is how may the impacts of climate change exacerbate conflict or on the opposite end be conducive to peace. So the research that is available on the interactions between climate change and conflict show that those linkages, those dynamics are complex, and they're also very specific to individual contexts and areas and regions and countries. There's no single systematic causal link between climate change and conflict. It really varies quite a bit. Climate change is often described as a threat multiplier, as it can exacerbate existing tensions, existing conflict dynamics. But on the other hand, climate change can also lead local, national, international actors to cooperate with one another as part of efforts to adapt to its effects. And that can also, conversely contribute to peace. In other situations, obviously, climate change can have very little effects on existing peace and conflict dynamics. So for the first point, climate change can contribute to fueling violence and conflict by intersecting with different types of issues in different ways. I've listed a few examples. So climate change can increase or decrease the availability of natural resources, in particular water, obviously, and land also for agriculture or cattle. And therefore, the ability for populations to access those resources and exploit them. So this can lead to competition. It can lead sometimes to violent conflict between members of communities whose entire livelihoods depend on those natural resources. It can also lead to conflict between communities and the central government. If some communities, for example, farmer communities, consider that the government is not helping them enough. It can also lead to conflict between different governments. For example, if they share access to water basins, lakes, other transboundary resources that are dwindling because of climate change, this can lead those governments to enter into violent conflict between one another. At the local level, it can also lead certain people to join armed groups because they have to find ways of surviving, providing for their families. And so since their livelihoods are threatened by climate change, they may end up joining armed groups, which can also contribute to conflict. Climate change can also have diverse impacts on the living situation and mobility of population groups. Sometimes it can lead groups to migrate in the face of livelihood insecurity. It can also change the movement patterns of certain communities who are nomadic, for pastoralist communities who have to bring their cattle to grazing land. It can lead them to have to move earlier in the year, or it can force them to take different routes. And this, those impacts on movement patterns can lead to conflict between groups. For example, if a pastoralist community has to go through the land that is used for agriculture by a farming community, it may be the case that a conflict erupts because some of the cattle of the herders, will go on the fields of the farmers. So some very basic dynamics that can be influenced by climate change. And also, obviously, climate change can increase the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events and natural disasters. And if governments and authorities do not adequately prevent, mitigate, and address the consequences of those natural disasters, this can undermine the trust of populations in authorities and therefore fuel grievances, lead to the exclusion of groups even more, and eventually lead to conflict. So one important thing to note in relation to what I just mentioned is that the resilience of population groups and of individuals to the effects of climate change and to conflict can vary by gender, by ethnicity, age, class, religion, sexual orientation, education, disability or ability, etc., and also how these identities intersect. So I'm trying to illustrate this since it's particularly apparent with regard to gender, since gender determines key aspects of how people experience and are able to respond to the effects of climate change. So for example, in terms of access to natural resources and to their use, this is often profoundly gendered, and therefore the effects of climate change on access to natural resources will have gendered effects. So for example, women frequently have to manage household responsibilities, such as collecting water and firewood in different countries. And so if resource scarcity is a result of climate change, then this can expose them to violence. For example, they may need to travel longer to have access to water points, or they may face domestic violence if they're not fulfilling their household responsibilities. In addition, resource scarcity may also, as I mentioned, pressure men into joining armed groups in order to provide for their families. So again, those are very gendered impacts. In addition, I mentioned how herder communities may have to adopt different routes for their cattle. They may have to travel further away to find land that is suitable for grazing. And in doing so, it's particularly young men who are part of the groups that move away with the cattle, and women and girls can be more likely to remain behind in villages, and sometimes they may face increased burdens to fulfill their traditional responsibilities, and again experience violence if they don't do so. This is also related to the general issue of governance structures. Governance structures, for example, that relate to how natural resources are managed inside a community or inside a district, even a country. Many governance structures continue to exclude and marginalize women, diverse women, but including young women, for example, but also other minority groups. And those patterns of exclusion can make these groups more vulnerable to the effects of extreme weather events, such as floods and droughts, precisely because their needs, their security was not sufficiently taken into account as part of preventing measures or as part of responses to those disasters. I also included a point, as you see below, on how climate change can also directly or indirectly contribute to peace and to gender equality. One example would be that, if they're faced with a reduced availability of natural resources, some groups may be forced to engage in dialogue with one another. There's little water available, so let's speak to one another, agree on how to divide the available resources between us. And cooperating on this can lead to developing trust and better cohesion between groups. In addition, sometimes, in situations where women and girls remain behind in villages, for example, while herder men are more absent, the increasingly feminized social composition of villages can lead to strengthened roles for women in decision-making structures. It can shift social perceptions of their ability to lead because precisely the men are absent, they have to take over those responsibilities, and they can gain legitimacy through this. In addition, as well, faced with the effects of climate change, women, in particular young and indigenous women, have been leading many protests and movements for sustainable change. So in doing so, in engaging in protest and pushing for change, women may also be carving out political spaces for themselves and take leadership positions, not because those are given to them, but because they're taking them through their activism, through their the movements that they create. And this can, again, contribute to changing social norms about their participation in political affairs, despite obviously the high personal risks that are associated with this, and sometimes the violence that they experience. So those are just a few examples to say that the interplay between gender and other identities with regard to how people experience and are able to respond to the linkages between climate change and conflict means that it's essential not to view men, women, boys, and girls as homogeneous groups, but rather it's important to identify patterns of inclusion and exclusion, how power is distributed between and within groups, and also what are the patterns of resilience and vulnerability. So another aspect that I wanted to cover, I discussed the impact of climate change on peace and conflict, but how may climate actions, for example, projects to adapt to climate change, also exacerbate conflict or conversely be conducive to peace? So there are multiple ways in which climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts can exacerbate conflict and fuel exclusion. For example, when projects fail to address systemic inequalities, climate change adaptation projects can entrench existing social hierarchies. They can weaken social cohesion. They can also contribute to increasing gender inequalities. If men, for example, are the ones that receive funding and support, this may strengthen their position even more to the detriment of women. Decisions also over which adaptation strategies to pursue can be taken based on the vested interests of certain political actors. They can benefit certain population groups over others. For example, if farmers are going to be supported for sustainable agricultural projects, perhaps they will receive more support, and herder communities will not receive as much support, and this can lead to increased tensions and conflict between the two groups. And also, programs that are aiming at protecting forests and other types of lands and natural resources can also sometimes fuel local tensions. They can foster mistrust towards authorities. They can reinforce inclusion. For example, when international actors or national authorities do not involve local communities whose livelihoods depend on those resources, water, land, trees, etc. If those actors are not consulted beforehand, this can lead to tensions afterwards. It doesn't mean that obviously we shouldn't pursue climate adaptation and climate mitigation projects, but it's important to involve local actors, consult local populations, understand their needs in order to avoid violence. So on the opposite side of the spectrum, climate adaptation and mitigation projects can also very much contribute to peace and have positive effects on gender equality. So in particular, projects that bring together different local actors and communities, as I mentioned beforehand, that empower those actors to implement collective activities, working together, supporting their own initiatives, fostering more inclusivity in local governance structures. We discussed previously the importance of ensuring that women are involved in decision-making processes and structures. This can be particularly helpful. Also, climate change adaptation efforts that relate to livelihood diversification. For example, if land is increasingly arid, providing farmer communities or herder communities with other sources of income and activity. This can sometimes provide opportunities for marginalized people and groups to engage in economic activities that previously they did not have access to, including because of traditional social norms, because of gender norms, etc. So this can actually result in the empowerment of certain women and marginalized groups. And one other aspect that I wanted to briefly mention, and I can provide more information later in the discussion, is climate adaptation efforts have also increasingly benefited from analysis processes that involve the use of meteorological data, climatic data, to make predictions on the evolution of weather and climate patterns on short term, on the medium term, on the long term. And so those analysis processes about how the weather and the climate may evolve can be associated with early warning mechanisms that are there to prevent conflict. For example, if we know that droughts may be coming, if we know that rainfall patterns are going to change, we can work more easily in advance with local communities to come to agreements, to ensure that herders and farmers, work together well. If herders have to go through the land of farmers, we can anticipate all that and prevent conflict. So that's, again, really helpful in combining climate adaptation and peace building efforts. So my next slide, I'll go very, very quickly over this because I'm already way past what I was hoping to spend in terms of time. This brings me to the role of climate sensitive and gender sensitive conflict analysis. So what do I mean by that? As we saw, the linkages between climate change, peace and conflict and gender equality are very complex. So what this means is that to reach a real understanding of the dynamics, it's necessary to avoid assumptions about the effects of climate change and of climate actions on conflict. Those can vary across areas, across regions, across countries. And this means that it's important to really analyze exactly where you're looking to intervene or where you're looking to support local actors. For example, you really have to analyze what are the concrete realities in this region, in this country, in this area. And so to do so, you have to go through some specific types of processes to really understand those local realities and the local dynamics. So what do we mean by doing a conflict analysis? A conflict analysis is really a process through which you're able to identify and understand a given context and the peace and conflict dynamics within it. So this means looking at the formal and informal institutions. Formal institutions are often not enough. There can be informal power structures, traditional leaders playing a role in addition to authorities. Those can be very varied. You also have to look at the key actors and population groups, their relations, the distribution of power between them, but also within them. Who holds power over what, with what types of activities and decisions, etc. You should also look at the political, economic, and social factors that may cause, sustain, and drive a conflict, including gender norms. But you should also look at the possible drivers and opportunities for peace. It's not only about identifying what can go wrong, but also what should be supported to build peace. And so as part of such analysis, it's really important to pay attention to gender, as we mentioned, and to the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. So this can mean looking at the diverse roles that different men and women may play in conflict, the different ways in which they may experience conflict. Again, having in mind that neither men nor women are homogeneous groups. It means looking at how gender norms and marginalization interact with other dynamics. For example, I mentioned that it may be expected of young men that they provide for their families, and as a result, if their livelihoods collapse, they may be driven to join armed groups. So how do gender norms and expectations play a role? And it's also important to look at how conflict itself can contribute to shaping gender norms. We mentioned earlier, if most men leave a village to take part in a conflict, perhaps the women who will remain will start endorsing different responsibilities. So again, there's an interconnection that has to be understood. In order to conduct those conflict analysis processes, it's really important, obviously, to speak to the local populations. You can't simply, be sitting in Brussels, in any European capital, and to think that you're going to know everything there is to know about, a local context in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Pacific, or even elsewhere in Europe. So you have to engage with local stakeholders, young people, marginalized groups, diverse women, to develop, nuanced understandings of social norms, of power dynamics, of people's experiences, etc., etc. It also means that the personnel that is involved in conflict analysis, that is trying to understand local context before designing a project or an intervention, a mediation activity or whatever, the personnel involved should have the adequate time and resources and the expertise on conflict prevention, on gender equality, on climate change and the environment to really carry out the analysis. And so I'll end my presentation with a sort of conclusion based on what I said before. So I spoke about analyzing the links between climate change, gender equality, and conflict. But what does this mean in terms of actions? What comes next? So once you've understood the context, one aspect of the actions that should follow that I wanted to highlight is the importance of supporting the roles of civil society actors, particularly local civil society actors. So both Alvina and Hussein already touched on this. It's extremely important to support, to work with and to support local civil society actors, local communities from the regions, the countries, and the areas that are affected by the climate and conflict nexus. This is because local civil society and communities are both key interlocutors to understand the effects of climate change on conflict. They know this, they live this, so they have the expertise, they have the knowledge, and we should be asking them if they want to tell us, of course. But also, those actors are already at the forefront of efforts to address these effects. This is something that they're addressing themselves on a day-to-day basis. They have their own initiatives. We shouldn't come up, with an agenda and with a framework that we would impose on them. We should be listening to them, understanding what they're already doing, and supporting their initiatives. And obviously, paying particular attention to inclusivity, to gender equality, to dynamics of exclusion, etc. This is particularly true of the efforts of those who are the most affected by climate change, conflicts, and violence, meaning women, young people, other marginalized groups. So, supporting in particular those actors. So overall, none of this is to say that the European Union is not doing, any of what I described. The EU has recognized the importance of addressing those connections. It is increasingly taking into account climate change in its conflict analysis and other types of assessments, and it has been supporting civil society efforts to address the effects of climate change. However, as you all know, given the magnitude of the challenges ahead and of climate change in particular, way more needs to be done to ensure that the EU's actions are sensitive to peace and conflict, to gender equality, and to climate change, and also to support to a much greater extent civil society efforts to address the climate and conflict nexus. And so I would very much echo Alvina's comments about the need for local ownership, and also Hussein's comments about the importance of funding peace building and of funding civil society efforts in particular. So with that, I'll end there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you and hear your wise thoughts on this matter. I especially found it very important when you said about how we can also do harm when we are doing good projects. For example, tackling climate crisis. That those are extremely important, but at the same time, we can definitely fund and do some measures that are escalating or provoking conflict or are acting against this positive peace thinking. So I think that we could first also take Hussein here on the line quite soon. That's perfect, because I think it's nice to have a bit also a mutual discussion. And please, if anyone has direct questions to Lorenzo at this point, especially those would be appreciated. But there is one general question already on the chat from Rosa, and she's asking, does EU include psychosocial peace building in its strategies? What do you think about the role of mental health and psychosocial support in peace building? I think this is really interesting, so perhaps we could also take a round to answer this. And I think it's also related to what you both said about the inclusiveness of peace projects and how people can get involved. So what kind of ideas does this raise with you? Lorenzo, would you like to start?
Absolutely, and thanks a lot, Rosa. That's an extremely important question, and I cannot agree more about the importance indeed of tackling mental health and psychosocial issues as part of peace building efforts. This is something that numerous organizations are either have already been doing or are increasingly starting to do, and it's very much related to the issues that I was touching on in my presentation, because as obviously you're well aware, natural disasters can completely affect the livelihoods of individuals. This can be extremely traumatic. Conflict can lead, obviously, to tremendously difficult to live experiences. And the intersection between the two can be particularly difficult to handle for individuals who are not receiving adequate support, for communities that are fractured because of compounded effects. Especially if governments are not providing affected communities and individuals with adequate support. And it's particularly important to be attentive to the particular needs of certain groups that are already quite vulnerable, both to climate change and conflict, to groups that are sometimes already harassed or completely left aside, even sometimes by authorities, by militaries, by armed groups, and whose vulnerabilities can only be exacerbated by the effects of climate change and by additional conflict. So I would say that this should be tackled at different levels. You can sometimes divide peace building interventions into interventions at the community level, at the national level, at the international level. It can vary quite a bit, and this is a bit of a caricature, but I think the importance of addressing mental health issues and psychosocial issues should really be mainstreamed at all levels. At the community level, it's particularly striking. Engaging with victims who may be experiencing still conflict, or who may have experienced conflict and threats to their livelihoods recently. It can relate to the different phases of conflict. During conflict, again, after conflict, as part of transitions back to peace, it's extremely important to tackle trauma and to address the difficult experiences that people may have gone through. And so having, mental health and psychosocial components to peace building interventions at the community level is extremely, extremely necessary. But the same is true for interventions at other levels, because obviously you cannot only, integrate and address those issues at the local level. It's also important to develop structures and mechanisms that are sustainable and that will be able to help, victims, affected groups on the long term beyond initial interventions. And so this is something that I think should be part and parcel of peace building efforts at all levels, and the importance of ensuring that, for example, public services are able to adequately address needs way beyond natural disasters, way beyond conflict phases is absolutely key. So those are just a few thoughts in relation to what I discussed before.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I absolutely agree. I would also give now the floor to Hussein, and then I can maybe give some few remarks as well.
Joo, Rosa, mahtava kysymys. An excellent question. 50% of the people living in Finland most likely at one point of their life will suffer from some sort of mental illness. It could be anxiousness to severe other illnesses, and so you don't actually need a war or a trauma or major development to be having some mental issues, and that's fine. I feel it's a human right to also have that, to be able to get a diagnosis and get the help you need and get the therapy you need. That's a human right in general, and it should be one of the human rights actually that the UN in more general, the EU and other bigger establishment would actually have in their charters as one of the human rights, as more and more people are suffering nowadays from even in their day-to-day lives from mental issues. And I remember I actually spent 9 days in a hospital because I was so severely sort of burnt at one point of my life, and the work the nurses did and the doctors did and the therapy that I got and all that was extremely important for me to be able to come back and give back to the society and be of use. So that in Finland, which is a safe, very prosperous country, what can you say about those places that Lorenzo just described? So definitely it should be one of the bigger sort of strands that we would look at when we're building funding mechanisms. And I don't think it's such a bad idea actually to have a physical funding mechanism that only would look at psycho mental issues and problems and traumas, and maybe have these peace mediation experts and actors and organizations collaborate with universities, with hospitals, with mental health institutions, and create new programs where these issues are looked upon. After the war against ISIS in Iraq, big humanitarian organizations established some mental health services for the children who lost their fathers or mothers or both. And I visited one of these facilities. It's such a sad thing that when I think about it, I feel like I want to cry. But it had a screaming room. It was a big room that had mattresses. It wasn't state-of-the-art institution, but there was a screaming room. It was a room with no windows. It had big mattresses, and they brought these kids, and they were allowed and encouraged to actually scream in these rooms so that they can get some of that negative energy that they're having and the trauma that they're having into that room, and then they were taken back to some of the therapy sessions and all that. So definitely much needed strand. And thank you so much, Rosa, for asking that question.
Yes, indeed. I would like to thank you, Rosa, as well. And I see also in the chat that there are plenty of people who have endorsed this question, and I very much agree with that. For me, this is of course my favorite topic as well. As some of you might know, I have been working for a long time with mental health and trying to bring better mental health services and access to therapy to Finland as well. So this is something I find important. However, these two questions, mental health and peace and conflict, are quite rarely combined, I think, in discussions, even though we all know, because we have been working with the peace projects and with the topic in different angles, we all know that those are very deeply intertwined. As you also said, Lorenzo and Hussein, I think there is significant things to consider, such as the trauma of people who are fleeing from areas of conflict and war, and also about how trauma and mental health issues can bring about violence, how it can also result if that's untreated and if people don't have good services and their basic human rights are not met, how this can also create conflict. So I think it's a very important question. I know actually that there is some thoughts about this topic in research, but there is not really that much in EU. There is actually one program in the United Nations about psychosocial support in peace building, and that's very interesting. But I don't see such in EU. But actually, Rosa, you have given me a lot of thought on this, because I could put forward such projects on the EU level as well, because the topic is very much a taboo in EU already. Thank you, Hussein, for sharing your personal experience. For me, I also have personal experiences with mental health issues after we had a school shooting in my school, and I had bad depression as a teenager. And basically, I have talked about these topics in the European Parliament as well, but my colleagues have been very confused about that. Sometimes they have said that you should not talk about these topics because you will not be taken seriously if you discuss your personal experience. And also, I got one comment when I was advocating for these easy access, free mental health services. I got one comment saying that it's great that you push for those topics in Finland, but we don't have mental health issues here in my home country. So it's not needed everywhere in Europe. I think this describes a bit of the issue. So we need to raise this topic into question in EU because it's really not considered enough. Okay, so I see that we don't. Well, do you have any additional comments to this, Hussein or Lorenzo? Maybe, I don't know if your thoughts raise something within each other.
Perhaps, if I may just add, first, I would very much like to echo what you just said, Hussein and Alvina. As you were saying, one does not need to experience, conflicts or climate change directly to, benefit immensely from mental health and psychosocial support. So that's an excellent point, and something that came to mind when you were speaking. In my presentation, I discussed, for example, livelihood diversification programs that can help people move to different types of activities if the ones that they were relying on for their livelihoods is threatened by climate change. Examples could include, fishing and farming and pursuing other activities instead. This is something that can seem extremely technical when you think about the general idea, but in practice, those livelihoods can be extremely tied to the identities of people, of communities, of families. And so having to change from an activity to another can be extremely difficult for them in relation to what this means for how they saw themselves and their identities as a community, as a family, or as an individual. And so again, this ties to the points that were raised about mental health and psychosocial support, because it can be extremely difficult, even if you're able on a day-to-day basis to do a different kind of activity. It can be extremely difficult to undergo such a change and to and to live your life in a very different direction, sometimes even after having to move, perhaps either within your country or to another country. And again, having access to this kind of support is extremely important. And I couldn't agree more with the importance of funding this to a much greater extent than is currently the case.
Thank you, Lorenzo. That was actually a very, very good thought. And definitely, I think that these are the topics that need more funding and more of our resources, because they really are at the core of well-being and basically what we are trying to push in our work as well. It's, of course, the absence of conflict, but also the well-being of people in different regards. There are no questions at this point at the chat. There are many people who are watching the broadcast, but you have been a bit shy to comment. So please go ahead if you still have any questions. Now is your time to present them. But also do not be stressed. If we do not have much questions, we can also wrap this up a bit earlier than we thought. And we also actually will have a next session next week about feminist foreign policy, which seems to be a topic based on these comments that is interesting for many of you. And also it was echoed and covered by Hussein and Lorenzo a lot about how do we get different groups of people and women involved, for example. There is also a comment from Rosa in the comment section about what we just said. It's interesting to think about the possibility of building of emotional skills in addition to trauma therapy and so on. And she also says that she's currently building a network combining research, civil society, and arts under the umbrella theme of Safe Climate. I think actually that's a really great title. So we wish you all the best with that, Rosa. And if anyone is interested to have more discussions on that, now with these virtual environments, it's quite easy to find each other from the comment sections. But definitely, I think that these are very, very core things that we should discuss. And also building these emotional skills is something I forgot to mention. For example, we have been pushing for mental health and emotional skills in schools already quite a lot. And I think that's very important that we also have mental health, emotional skills training already from young kids. And, we should not delve too deep into this topic. But for example, if Vladimir Putin would have more adequate knowledge of emotional skills and mental health, maybe he would have found better ways to pursue his means in this world. So I mean that, of course, we cannot put things this black and white kind of way. But when we discuss children especially, then it's very important that we give them means to change the world for the better. And I think that's something we should put more emphasis on. Hussein, do you have any comments on this? You look like you have.
Yeah, definitely on what you brought Putin up. But first on the issue of mental health, a lot of the times mental health issues one might have are symptoms to what happened prior in life. And so a lot of the issues can be resolved from active peace building, but also from, more simpler issues to understand, which, for example, if you guarantee a place to have a hobby for a lot of the children, and then through that to have friends and have these social contacts, then you would be actually looking at some of the root causes that maybe later in life would become a mental health issue. So building and making sure that kids have one hobby at least in their life. And I think Iceland has an excellent sort of example of that. They had a lot of kids who had mental health issues, and then they integrated some of the issues in their schools, and they made sure that every kid had a hobby, at least one hobby, and some of these other issues, and they were able to tackle the root causes. But when it came to President Putin of Russia, I think one of the issues that I've actually noticed in my work is the issue of agency. A lot of the people who I consider bad when I talk to them about the reason and the justification for them to give an order to start an actual armed conflict, or not to stop an armed conflict, or not to help some people who are in a very bad position, they come out with explanations on why it is imperative and very important, and for security and for the national interest and for the well-being of some groups, that why they're doing what they're doing. And sometimes they use the timelines and say, well, in a sort of a longer timeline, this will be then considered a good thing, not doing something or doing something. And that idea where the person is allowed to have that free thought of why being bad is okay, is something that one must tackle more in diplomacy, and have that dialogue when you're actually training your diplomats in the EU, and also your peace builders, on how to concretize what's going on, and how to be able to counter some of these arguments that these people have through their agency and ego. And the other thing that I also noticed in some of these countries that I've worked in, is some of these people have their own job, their own sort of political future, or their own job security, bound to making decisions that make the conflict bigger. So them staying in that position, even though it's a very low position, but them staying in that position, they might be very quickly gatekeepers to you being able to open the next door to make sure. So sometimes you have somebody who is a general director at a ministry who will prevent you from going further because he's afraid of what will happen to him. But you know that if you go through him to the next level, to the vice minister, you're able to actually free some people up to do some other things and, enact a truce. But that person will stop you and become a bottleneck because he's afraid to what happens to him. And if you go around him, usually him, it's men, you go around him, then for sure you'll make an enemy out of him, and he has the vice minister's ear when you're not there, and he'll ruin the entire project. So as a peace mediator, you're being fronted with a choice where you go through him, or you have the patience when he says no, not to go. But then you'll know that there'll be a lot of people dying because you are unable to help him. And that is a position where I was in many times, and I went back and forth to this exact same person many times, until I got him to open the door for the next level. So sometimes Martti Ahtisaari, and I'll stop with this. Martti Ahtisaari, he was asked sort of what's required of a peace mediator. What's the one thing that is required of somebody becoming a peace mediator? He said, you have to be stubborn like a jackass, like a donkey. You have to be absolutely stubborn, so that you will never take a no for an answer. You'll never take a no for an answer. You have to be able to come back again and again and again and never quit. And I think that was his sort of style of doing things. And I wish him good health nowadays. He's an old man, but we love him dearly in Finland.
Thank you, Hussein. Definitely, this brought back a lot of memories from discussing peace and conflict by the fire with Martti Ahtisaari in CMI trainings, and we had these very pleasant exchanges with him. Very honorable person. So thank you all. I think this has been really interesting. Maybe I start wrapping up quite soon, so that we can continue to our next activities. Mine involves being with children, which is always a happy activity. I think it has been a really thought-provoking discussion with you too. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. And I see that the audience has really also thanked you both and us all in the chat. So I think that what we have covered is basically some of the basic priorities and basic thoughts on peace building and conflict prevention. Also, we touched upon the EU programs, and we also touched about some thematic issues related to this. For example, climate crisis and involving young people and women. And as I mentioned, we will continue that discussion next week when we have the training on EU and, well, especially feminist foreign policy, not only EU. And as Hussein mentioned already, we can also be, in contact with any of the participants after this, at least for me and Hussein in Instagram, and also with Lorenzo in different means. So I think you can continue the discussion with us in there. And I hope also that we can continue discussion with you both at some point, because it has been really interesting. Also, what was brought to my mind about this discussion was how concrete those obstacles to peace often are. For example, what Hussein said about women and taking care of children, and how actually this kind of systematic discrimination can happen even inside peace processes, because there is no nursing or other kind of activities allowed, and to support women to participate. I think this was really interesting. And what it gives everybody who is working with peace and conflict, I hope it gives us all food for thought, that how very concrete these questions often are, and what we should do to tackle these questions. Also, a lot what Lorenzo said about the climate crisis, and how these basic human rights can also be in contradiction with fighting climate crisis if we don't do it right. So this was very interesting. I think Adele can share also our Instagram and emails there that have been shared now in the chat, so you can contact us later on as well. Thank you both. Have a pleasant evening, and wow, this is something we will be thinking for the whole night about these discussions, and let's continue having them later on. And thank you everyone who has been involved here.
Okay. Thank you, Alvina. Kiitos. Merci, Lorenzo.
Thanks to you, Hussein, as well. Have a nice day.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, the participants. Bye-bye. See you next time.